It all started in high school. Ben and I, we were inseparable. From the moment we met in freshman year, something clicked between us. It wasn't forced, it wasn't contrived. It just was. The kind of friendship where you don't have to try, where it feels like you've known each other your entire life. We did everything together. Classes, sports, video games, late-night conversations about absolutely nothing and everything. Ben was always the first person I turned to, no matter what life threw at me. He had this relaxed vibe about him, a confidence that never wavered. He was always so sure of himself, so laid back, and I admired him for it. But recently, something was different, and I didn't know how to explain it. It was subtle, so subtle that I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface, in every glance, every joke, every laugh. Something was shifting, and I didn't know what to do with it. Every Thursday after school we had swim practice. It was part of our routine, something so normal, so predictable. Afterward, we would hit the locker room chatting away, decompressing from the day. But that one Thursday, everything felt off. The locker room was silent when we entered, the echo of our footsteps the only sound that filled the space. The rest of the team had already gone home, leaving just the two of us. I could feel it in the air, the tension, the weight of something unspoken. It pressed against me, suffocating in its quiet intensity. Ben, though, he was fine, totally chill. The same old Ben tossing his swim bag onto the bench with that easy confidence that made him, well, him. We started changing, the quiet sound of fabric shifting between us. I tried not to look, but I couldn't help myself. I'd always admired Ben, the way he carried himself so effortlessly. But now I saw him differently. And that thought, it shouldn't have made my heart race, but it did. My palms were sweating, my thoughts were tangled, and the space between us felt electric. I caught myself glancing over at him, trying not to let it show. But then, just as I turned away, Ben caught my eyes. And then, of course, he smirked, the way he always did when he knew something was up. "Hey, man," he said, tossing his towel to the side. "You're acting weird. What's going on?" The question hung in the air, and I froze. His voice was light, teasing, but there was something in it, something different, that made my stomach twist. I couldn't lie to him. But could I tell him the truth? Could I say the words that had been swirling around in my head? What if he didn't feel the same? What if I lost him? "Nothing," I stammered. "Just tired. You know, long day." But Ben wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, his gaze sharpening, his eyes locking onto mine with a level of intensity I wasn't used to. I felt exposed, like he could see straight through me. "Come on," he said, his voice quieter now. "You can tell me anything. You know that." And then, before I even knew what was happening, the words spilled out. "Ben," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "I've been feeling something different lately. About us. I don't know how to explain it, but it's more than just friendship." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and for a moment, neither of us moved. My heart was hammering in my chest, my palms sweaty, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. I braced myself for the worst, for rejection, for everything to fall apart. But then, Ben did something I didn't expect. He reached out and placed a hand on my arm. His touch was warm, steady, and in that moment I could feel the world shifting. "I've been feeling it too," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. I couldn't believe it. Did he really say that? My mind was racing, heart thudding, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to breathe, to hope. There we stood, inches apart, and for the first time the tension between us wasn't awkward. It was something else. It was electric. Ben's hand lingered on my arm, his fingers brushing against my skin as if testing the waters. My body was on fire, every nerve alive with anticipation, but I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do next. What if this was a mistake? What if we lost everything? But then he stepped closer. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, barely able to form the words. The vulnerability in my voice caught me off guard. He didn't hesitate. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And that was it. There was no turning back. We stood there motionless, suspended in the fragile space between reality and something else, something undefined. Ben's hands were still on me, grounding me in this new, surreal moment, but his touch, once so familiar, now felt heavier. The air hung thick with unspoken words, the kind that had been simmering for so long, too long, that it was almost suffocating. I couldn't breathe, not really. The rush of emotions inside me, disbelief, relief, hope, tumbled over each other, colliding in chaotic waves. Did this really happen? Did I just lay my feelings bare to my best friend? And did he really just say he felt the same? The weight of his confession hung in the air between us, almost tangible, and I could hardly grasp it. It was as if I had stepped into a dream, one where anything was possible. But then I remembered. This was real. His touch, his words, the weight of his gaze. It was all happening. I didn't know how to tell you, I stammered, the words coming out in a nervous rush. My throat was tight, my chest a storm of confusion. I was scared that if I said anything, things would change. Ben shook his head slowly, his expression softening in a way that made my heart skip. "It's not weird," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not if we're both feeling it." And then he took a step closer, closing the distance between us, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, the air between us was less suffocating. It wasn't just that we were standing here, in the quiet of the locker room, each of us trying to make sense of what had just transpired. No, this was something else. This was the unmistakable shift of our friendship into something undefined, something more. I could feel the change in every part of me, like the ground beneath my feet was unsteady, and there was no going back. Not that I wanted to. I wanted to say something, anything to fill the space, but the words didn't come. There were too many of them, too many tangled emotions I couldn't unravel. How had we gone from inseparable friends, sharing everything, to this quiet, charged moment where the boundaries between us had dissolved, revealing something new, something we hadn't even known was there? Ben must have sensed my hesitation. Without saying a word, he stepped closer, his hand gently resting on my shoulder. His touch was grounding, steady, but there was something more there, something in the way his fingers pressed against me. "I've been trying to figure out how to bring this up," he murmured, his voice low and careful, like he was choosing each word with precision. "I didn't want to mess up what we had, but I can't ignore it anymore. I've been feeling it for a while now. I just didn't know if you felt the same." His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a mix of relief and disbelief. This was real. Ben, the same Ben who had been my best friend, my confidant, was feeling the same way. He had been holding back, just like me, afraid of what might happen if he let these feelings out into the open. "I didn't know how to tell you either," I admitted, my voice barely more than a breath. "I thought if I said something, everything would change, and I didn't want to lose you." Ben's smile was soft, almost knowing. It wasn't just a smile of relief, it was a smile of understanding. A smile that said he had been waiting for this, just like I had. A smile that reassured me, not with words, but with the unspoken promise in his eyes. "You're not going to lose me," he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet confidence. "We'll figure this out together." Together. That word hung in the air, heavy with its meaning. The weight that had settled in my chest, this mixture of uncertainty, fear, and longing, seemed to lift in that moment. We weren't alone in this anymore. We had each other. That was all that mattered. Ben's hand moved from my shoulder, sliding to the back of my neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin there, sending a jolt of heat through me. The air between us shifted again, this time into something new, something filled with anticipation. It wasn't the nervous tension we'd been dancing around for weeks. This was different. This was filled with the quiet promise of something more, something we hadn't dared to imagine. For a moment, everything fell away. I didn't care about the world outside the locker room. I didn't care about anything except him. Ben's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt completely seen, completely understood. The world outside faded into a blur, and in that moment it was just the two of us. He leaned in slowly, his lips hovering just inches from mine. The space between us felt like an eternity, like the universe was holding its breath. His breath brushed against my skin, warm and steady, and my heart pounded in my chest. Time seemed to stretch, and for just a second, I thought it might break. And then he closed the gap. His lips met mine in a kiss that was soft, tentative, like we were both trying to find our way in this new space we had created. It was everything I had imagined it would be, and nothing like I had expected. It was a release, a surrender to the feelings we had both been holding back for so long. The kiss deepened, and everything that had been building, every thought, every unspoken word, flooded to the surface. His hand tightened on the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body against mine. Every nerve in my body ignited, alive with sensation. When we finally pulled away, breathless, our foreheads rested against each other. The world seemed to quiet around us, the tension of the moment lingering in the space between us. Ben's eyes were full of something I had never seen before, a mixture of affection, desire, and relief. It was like the walls between us had finally come down, and for the first time we were seeing each other as we truly were. "I've wanted to do that for so long," Ben whispered, his voice rough with emotion. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning of something new, something beautiful, and something we would navigate together. The weight of Ben's confession hung in the air between us, a delicate thread of honesty that tethered us together in a way I hadn't expected. His voice, soft and sincere, made the words feel real, like they belonged in the world, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my heart swelled with something new, something that wasn't fear or uncertainty, but joy. I smiled, the corners of my lips lifting in a way that felt foreign but so right. "Me too," I whispered back, the words barely escaping my lips as if to keep them from slipping away. There was something so freeing about saying them aloud, about finally admitting what had been gnawing at me for so long. I had been terrified of what might happen if I ever spoke this truth, but now that it was out, it felt like everything clicked into place, as if the world had realigned itself. We stood there for a moment, not moving, just letting the gravity of what had just happened settle around us. It wasn't awkward, though. There was comfort in the silence, a reassurance that what we had just shared was the first step in something more. Ben reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a simple yet profound gesture that spoke volumes. It was the kind of touch that said more than words ever could, a promise that whatever came next, we would face it together. My heart beat a little faster at the realization that, for once, we were both on the same page, and the fear that had clouded my thoughts for so long had finally dissipated. "I guess we should get out of here before someone comes in," Ben said with that familiar grin, his eyes twinkling with mischief, as though nothing had changed. The easy humor that had always been a part of our friendship was still there, but now it carried a new weight, one that felt deeper, more meaningful. "Yeah, probably a good idea," I agreed, squeezing his hand before reluctantly letting go. But even as we began to gather our things, I felt the connection between us still thrumming, steady and unyielding. The bond had shifted, irrevocably, into something new. We weren't just friends anymore, not in the way we used to be. We had crossed into uncharted territory, and the realization both scared and exhilarated me. As we walked out of the locker room side by side, I couldn't help but notice how everything felt different. The world outside felt muted, like the noise had been turned down just for us. We didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. There was comfort in the quiet, in knowing that everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in that brief exchange of vulnerability back in the locker room. Now it was just about being here in this moment together. We crossed the school grounds, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, grounding me back in reality. But even the setting sun casting its golden glow over the campus couldn't shake the sense that something had changed between us. This new reality was ours now, and it was as if the rest of the world had blurred out of focus. It was just the two of us, walking into the unknown, but somehow knowing that whatever came next, we would be all right. I stole a glance at Ben, caught off guard by how different he seemed. It was subtle, but undeniable, like the weight of the tension that had hovered between us for weeks had finally lifted, leaving behind someone more relaxed, more open. He caught me looking, and his grin spread wider, his eyes dancing with that same mischievous spark I had always loved. But now there was something else in his expression, a softness and openness. "What?" he asked, his voice playful, but with a newfound tenderness that I hadn't noticed before. "Nothing," I replied quickly, a smile tugging at my lips. "It's just, I don't know. Everything feels different now." Ben nodded, his expression turning more serious for a moment. "Yeah, it does, but in a good way, right?" I didn't hesitate. "Yeah, in a really good way." We reached the parking lot, and as we stopped by Ben's car, I could feel the shift between us again. His presence was more intense now, but in a way that felt exciting rather than intimidating. It was like everything had been building to this point, and now there was no more hesitation. Ben turned to face me, the same intensity in his eyes as before, but this time it wasn't nervous energy. It was anticipation. "So, what now?" he asked, leaning casually against the hood of his car, but there was an unmistakable question in his voice, a sense that he was inviting me to step forward into whatever this was. I shrugged, trying to act nonchalant, even though my heart was racing. "I don't know. I guess we just figure it out, one step at a time." Ben's smile softened, and there was that familiar understanding glint in his eyes. "One step at a time," he repeated, almost as if the words themselves were a promise. Then he reached for my hand again, just like he had back in the locker room, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background. The world felt distant, irrelevant, as if the only thing that mattered was us standing there, holding hands in the dimming light. "I'm glad you told me," Ben said after a moment, his voice quiet but sincere. I don't know how much longer I could have kept it in. I laughed, the sound light and easy, a contrast to the heaviness that had marked the days before. Me neither. I was losing my mind trying to figure out what to do. Ben chuckled, shaking his head. "We're such idiots." I smiled, my heart swelling with happiness. "Yeah, but we figured it out eventually." We stood there for a moment longer, just soaking in the stillness of the evening, the quiet intimacy between us. It was strange, how everything felt the same and yet so completely different. We were still the same people, still best friends, but now there was something more. Something that had always been there beneath the surface, and it had taken us this long to finally recognize it. "We should probably get going," Ben said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "My mom's gonna kill me if I'm late for dinner again." I laughed again, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "Yeah, same here. Let's get out of here before we both get grounded." Ben grinned, and as we let go of each other's hands, we climbed into his car. As he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, I leaned back in my seat, my mind still racing with everything that had happened. I glanced over at him, watching him as he focused on the road, his jaw set in concentration, his hands steady on the wheel. There was something different about him now, something I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the way his shoulders were more relaxed, or the way he smiled at me when our eyes met. Or maybe it was the simple fact that we had finally been honest with each other. Whatever it was, I felt like we were heading in the right direction, even if I didn't know exactly where that direction would lead. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar streets passing by in a blur. It wasn't until we were about halfway to my house that Ben broke the silence, his voice low, thoughtful. "Hey, about earlier," he began, glancing over at me. "I just want you to know that nothing has to change between us. I mean, it will change, obviously, but we don't have to rush into anything. We can take things slow, figure it out." The words hung in the air, delicate and tentative, as if they carried the weight of everything that had come before them and everything that could come after. Ben's voice was steady, but there was a softness to it, a carefulness I hadn't noticed before. "Yeah, I'd like that," I said, the thoughtfulness in his words seeping into me, grounding me in the moment. Ben nodded, looking relieved, and I saw something shift in him, as if the burden of unspoken things had lifted just a little. "Good. I don't want you to feel like we have to do anything, just because we're both feeling this. We can just be us, like we've always been." I smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a peace settle over me. Just us. It was a simple phrase, but it was enough. It carried so much weight, an unspoken promise. We were two best friends standing on the edge of something neither of us had anticipated, something that had shifted between us, something we were both learning to navigate quietly and carefully. As we pulled up to my house, Ben turned to me. His eyes met mine, and that familiar connection was there, stronger now, deeper, like it had grown roots without either of us realizing it. But there was something else too, something softer, as if the world had somehow conspired to give us this moment of clarity, this understanding. "I'll see you tomorrow?" His voice held a quiet hope. "Of course." I smiled, that warmth spreading through me again as I opened the car door. There was a lightness now, a gentleness in the way he looked at me. The tension was gone, replaced by something new, something uncertain but reassuring. Ben grinned, the same easy grin, but with a layer of relief. "Good. See you then?" I closed the door behind me and watched as he drove off down the street, the taillights slowly fading into the distance. I stood there for a moment, the soft hum of the evening around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't perfect. We didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried about what came next. We had time. We had each other. And that was enough for now. As I walked up the driveway, I felt a lightness in my chest that had been absent for so long. The uncertainty that had always lingered in the back of my mind had finally quieted. I didn't know what the future held, but there was a new confidence in me now. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The next day at school felt different, but not in the way I'd imagined. When I walked into homeroom, there was Ben, sitting at our usual spot, looking calm, collected, like nothing had changed. For a moment, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe yesterday had been a dream, something my mind had conjured up in the haze of too many unspoken words. But then Ben looked up. Our eyes met, and that familiar smile spread across his face. It was the same smile I had always known, but now it had a new warmth, something just for me. "Hey," he said casually, sliding his backpack to the side to make room for me. "Ready for today?" I hesitated for just a beat, the surreal feeling still lingering, but then I snapped back to the moment, smiled, and sat down beside him. "Yeah, totally." And just like that, we slipped back into our old rhythm, talking about the English test we hadn't studied for, making jokes about how we'd probably fail. Nothing had changed. Not really. But there was something beneath it all, something deeper now, a quiet understanding between us that didn't need words, a layer to our friendship that had always been there but was now impossible to ignore. Throughout the day, I caught myself glancing at Ben. In the hallway, at lunch, in class, every time I'd catch him looking at me too, our eyes would lock and it felt like we shared a secret, an understanding no one else could see. It was both comforting and thrilling, like we were living in this parallel space where only the two of us existed, and it made everything feel different. After school, we headed to swim practice like we always did. It was routine, something we did without thinking, but today it felt significant. Maybe it was just me overthinking things, or maybe Ben felt it too, but something about the way we moved through the motions felt more important. Something big was happening, even if we couldn't quite name it yet. Practice passed in a blur, and before I knew it, we were back in the locker room, the familiar hum of the space almost comforting now. But this time, it felt different. The air was lighter, more relaxed. The tension from weeks of unspoken things was gone, replaced by something softer, easier. We didn't say much as we changed, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was like we didn't need words anymore. We were both caught in this new space, trying to figure out what it all meant. And then, just as I was about to toss my towel into my bag, Ben broke the silence. "Hey," he said, his voice steady and low. My heart skipped. I hadn't expected him to bring it up, at least not so soon. But when I turned to look at him, his expression wasn't tense. It wasn't uncertain. He was calm, like he had thought about this all day and was finally ready to say what was on his mind. "I've been thinking about it," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page." I nodded slowly, unsure of where this was going, but trusting him enough to let him lead. "I meant what I said yesterday," he continued, his voice firm but kind. "I've been feeling this for a while, and I'm glad we finally talked about it. But I also don't want you to feel like we have to rush into anything. I want us to take our time, figure this out together, whatever that means." Together. The word hung in the air between us, carrying so much promise, so much weight. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Yeah," I said, my voice soft but sure. "I want that too. We don't have to figure everything out right now. We can just take it slow." Ben smiled, and for a moment it felt like everything was going to be okay. Like we could navigate this together, whatever it was, without losing what we had, without losing each other. "I'm glad we're on the same page," Ben said, pulling his shirt over his head. "I've been thinking about it all day, and I didn't want you to feel like I was expecting anything. I don't want to mess this up." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not going to mess it up. We're in this together, remember?" His eyes softened, and for a second I thought he might reach for my hand again. But instead, he just nodded, his expression full of gratitude. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Together." We finished getting dressed in silence, the air between us lighter, filled with the understanding that we didn't need to rush. We didn't need to have all the answers. We had time to figure it out, to figure us out. As we left the locker room and stepped into the cool evening air, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the same rush of excitement or nervous energy that had been there the day before. This was quieter, more grounded, like I was starting to understand what this new chapter in our relationship was going to look like. Ben walked beside me, hands in his pockets, his usual easygoing demeanor back in place. We didn't talk much as we made our way to the parking lot, but the silence between us wasn't awkward. It wasn't heavy. It was just normal. When we reached his car, Ben turned to me, his eyes meeting mine once again. There it was, that look, the one that held so much more than words ever could. It was the kind of look that asked questions, but didn't need to hear the answers. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice casual, but I could hear the question beneath it. "Are we okay? Is this okay? Are we still us?" I smiled, nodding. "Yeah, same time tomorrow." And just like that, we were back to normal, or as close to normal as we could be, given everything that had changed between us. But that was okay. We were figuring it out one step at a time. As long as we had each other, I knew we could handle whatever came next. As Ben drove away, I stood there for a moment, watching his car disappear down the road. I didn't feel that rush of uncertainty anymore. I didn't feel the same fear of what might come next. All I felt was calm. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried about the future. Because whatever came next, I knew one thing for sure. Ben and I would face it together.